Good afternoon, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Jennifer Cooley, and I am the Education and Outreach Manager for the State Historical Museum of Iowa. The Iowa History 101 webinars share Iowa stories in the history of the state through a cultural history lens on the second and fourth Thursdays of each month. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at iowaculture.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you would like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live, all presentations will be recorded. Today, we will learn about the historical and ethnographic research on meatpacking, migration, and religious faith in the state of Iowa. We will also explore what led to this focus and why histories and ethnographies of Iowa and its rural past and present matter. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in a few days. I have disabled the chat function, but if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague Matt Weir is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note, we may not be able to get to all of your questions. Now I'm pleased to introduce our presenter, Kristy Nabhan-Warren. Kristy is professor and VO at the inaugural Elizabeth Call Figge Chair of Catholic Studies at the University of Iowa in the departments of Religious Studies and Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies. She is the new Associate Vice President of Research and Development for the Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences at the University of Iowa starting on July 1st. Kristy's research and books focus on U.S. Latinx Catholics in the United States and include The Virgin of El Barrio, Marian Apparitions, Catholic Evangelicizing, and Mexican-American Activism, Curcios in America, Catholics, Protestants, and Fourth-Day Spirituality, and American Women, The Virgin of Guadalupe, Latinos and Latinas, and Accompaniment. Kristy's newest book, which came out last September with the University of North Carolina Press, is Meatpacking America, How Migration, Work, and Faith Unite and Divide the Heartland. The book launch has kept Kristy happily busy with Zoom lectures, in-person presentations, podcasts, radio shows, and reading groups. Kristy is also the editor of the Oxford Handbook of Latinx Christianities in the United States, published by Oxford University Press, which came out last month. Kristy is the creator and series editor for the UNC Press book series called Where Religion Lives, which provides her with the opportunity to mentor and work with scholars who approach the study of religion form as an ethnographic perspective. And now I'm very happy to turn it over to Kristy to begin the webinar.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Thanks for having me here. I've been really looking forward to this, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. I look forward to your questions later and to a conversation. So I'm going to go through, I have a lot of slides today. I've timed it at about 1.5 minutes per slide, and I'm just going to kind of talk you through my research that led to the publication of this book and why I believe very strongly that the history and ethnography of our state of Iowa matters in a very deep way. So the title of my talk today is The Book Talks, or the title of my new book. Okay, so when I moved here to teach at the University of Iowa in the fall of 2012, I started to think about what is the next book project going to be? And as an ethnographer, someone who does the anthropology of religion, someone who situates herself where she happens to be, I've really always believed in blooming where I'm planted. And all of my projects happen to be about places where I've lived. And each book has sort of led to the other one because of the questions and concerns of my interlocutors. I call them interlocutors rather than informants because as ethnographers, we really get to know the men and women we work with over many years. And oftentimes they become friends and we become very close to them. So I love the method of ethnography because it really gets us inside the heart of people's lives, you know, what they're thinking, how they're worshiping, and what things matter to them. And so when I moved to Iowa City, I thought, okay, I want to do something on Iowa. It was really important to me as a lifelong Midwesterner. I'm a Hoosier. I'm from Indiana. I lived in all the I states except for Idaho. So I'm going to have to visit Idaho soon, I think. And so my question, my framing question was, why explore rural and small town Iowa? which many scholars and many folks have pointed out that the Midwest, the Heartland, is the heart of America. And so I really wanted to get at, what does this whole heart of America mean? And as someone who grew up in the Rust Belt, I grew up in Gary, Indiana, and some of the communities outside of Gary. I grew up in a steel mill town, and so I was very new to the rural Midwest, and I really wanted to learn about the history of our state and the place of farming and what became meatpacking. Okay, so the research for this book spanned over 7 years, and it mostly was in central Iowa and in eastern Iowa. I didn't cover the entire state in terms of my ethnography, but I did a lot of secondary source reading and a lot of primary source reading. And so I'm going to take you through my field work and talk about some of the secondary source information that I read over many years for this book. So when I started this book as, back in 2012, I thought it was going to be called Corn Belt Catholicism, because as someone who has a Catholic Studies endowed chair, it's really important to me to write something for Iowa Catholics who are funding part of my position here at the University of Iowa. And so I started literally driving around the state. I wanted to get a feel for it. I started reading up about the parish history, the Catholic history of the state. That's all cited in the book, so I won't go through it with you here. But there really hasn't been a lot done on sort of the contemporary religious scene in Iowa. And as a scholar, I have long been interested in what scholars call the intersectionality, the intersections, in my case, of work, migration, and religion. And this very much stems to my own childhood, the granddaughter of Lebanese and Polish migrants who worked in the steel mills and who were Catholic. And so when I decided on my field sites, I decided on Columbus Junction, Iowa, and I started doing field work in St. Joseph, the worker parish in Columbus Junction. I also started doing field work in West Liberty in their St. Joseph's. Those of you who are Catholic, there's a lot of St. Joseph's in our state, as well as in other Midwestern states. And I also did some field work at the Washington, Iowa, at St. James Parish. I intended this project to be a very tight, close study of comparing different parishes and how specifically Iowa Catholic parishes were responding to the new migrations of Latinos, primarily from the Northern Triangle, Mexico, El Salvador, and Guatemala. Those are primarily the Latinos who have been coming to our state for the past 15 years. And as I realized in what ethnographers call the snowball method, things just sort of roll along. You meet people, they introduce you to other people. We also have quite a few Congolese migrants. And so when I started this project, I thought it was going to be a very tight study of Catholic parishes, which it was in many ways, and specifically Latinos and white ethnic parishioners who remained the focus of the study. But I also, as I ventured into a couple meatpacking plants, as I'll share with you, interviewed quite a few African refugees as well. So here's one of my sites. I became very close with Father Joseph Sia, as you can see him here in a stole, who was a priest, and I would call him a social justice advocate. Father Joseph is now at St. Patrick's Parish here in Iowa City. And there is a new parish priest who I'll be talking a little bit about later. But Father Joseph became a very close friend and interlocutor, really helped me get to know his Latino parishioners, helped me get access into the Tyson Meatpacking Plan in Columbus Junction. And here is Father Joseph from about 2014. Every year, Father Joseph puts on a mass for migrant farm workers in Conesville who work for Bell's Melons. And so those of you who know a little bit about Catholic history, what's really interesting is that Catholic priests have a long history of doing social justice work and worker advocacy. And Father Joseph Sia is a recent iteration in a long line of Catholic priests who are very pro-worker. Most certainly, we're hearing a very different story these days, which is also true about Catholic priests, one that is not nearly as positive. And so what I chose to focus on in this book are those Catholic priests who are very social justice oriented and who are trying to make their Catholic parishes places for all, in what sociologists of religion would call shared parishes. And so as a religious studies scholar, I work cross-disciplinarily. So I read a lot of history, I read a lot of sociology, I read a lot of anthropology, and all these different fields and scholarship have very much impacted my own work. So if you've happened to read Meatpacking America, and I'll pick it up here, you'll see that it's very mixed method. It's historical, but it's also deeply ethnographic. Columbus Junction, I wanted to share with you a picture. Sorry, it's a little grainy for my own field work. Um, I've long been interested in Latino Catholic, the rich ritual lives that they live. And those of you who have been lucky enough, I would encourage you to go. It's called Doce de Diciembre, every December 12th. At most parishes, Latino majority parishes, especially those in our state, there's a celebration of the Virgin of Guadalupe. The story is that she appeared to Juan Diego on December 12th. Both La Virgen de Guadalupe, she is now been officially canonized, by the church, and Juan Diego has been sainted. And so it's a very important celebration for Latino Catholics, and increasingly for white ethnic Catholics, non-Latino white Catholics who go to the same parishes, who see the beauty and the rituals and the faith of their Latino fellow parishioners. So when I started this project, I had no idea that I would ever step foot in a meatpacking plant. That's what I love about ethnography, but that's also what's very daunting about it. And I think my friends who do a lot of archival work, those of you who are historians in the audience, I think it's very similar. When you're in an archive, you have a plan, you have an idea of what you want to find, but then you might find that one document, right, that really changes the scope of your project. Well, the meatpacking plant, that's analogous to sort of my talking to, by that point, probably over 90 Latino parishioners in St. Joseph, Columbus Junction, St. Joseph, West Liberty, and then in Washington, Iowa as well, to a lesser degree. Every single Latino Catholic parishioner I talked to worked in a meatpacking plant. Those Latinos who go to St. Joseph, Columbus Junction work in the Tyson fresh hog processing plant, Columbus Junction. Those Latinos who are in West Liberty, some work at the Tyson plant, Columbus Junction, others work in the West Liberty Foods, which is a turkey processing plant in West Liberty. So that was one of those surprises. And that's what I love about doing research. I tell my students, I think what I love so much about research is it's always about learning. I have a lot of curiosity, and you're always learning, right? And also learning about what questions should I be asking that I wasn't asking. And so because I was what anthropologists and sociologists call, when I was coding my interviews, I noticed when I was highlighting interviews and trying to find themes and commonalities that like 98% of my interlocutors, respondents, worked in meatpacking plants. So I had to go into meatpacking plant. And I was fortunate enough that Father Joseph Sia was friends with the then chaplain, Joe Blay. Tyson, you may or may not know this, but Tyson has the largest chaplaincy program of any business globally. That was also a surprise to me. Chaplains, I know there's a lot of chaplains in workplaces. That's a growing phenomenon. But since 2000, there's been a chaplain inside every single Tyson plant, whether it's beef or chicken. And so I pulled this from the website. So according to Tyson, they provide passionate pastoral care to team members and their families, regardless of their religious affiliation or beliefs. Today, there's over 100 full and part-time chaplains in 22 US states where there are, again, Tyson plants, who informally make themselves available to talk to team members. So that was another surprise of this research. So I got to meet Joe Blay during my first tour of the Tyson plant in Columbus Junction. We've kept in touch since. Joe has since left his job, and he's now a part-time pastor at the Methodist Church in Columbus Junction, and he's also a hospital chaplain here in Iowa City. But he was at this Tyson plant for over 8 years. And so as someone who studies religion, right, and someone who's interested in work and migration, it became very clear to me that I needed to look at these intersections very deeply, because what I was seeing at the Tyson plant was what I would call a lexicon of faith that was coming down from the top down, right? That was coming down from the CEO, CFO, the plant, the line shift managers. Everyone was using this kind of language of faith and values and belief and wanting to be there for the workers, right? But what I was hearing for from the workers themselves is they weren't necessarily thinking about, the workplace as a religious space, or not even really wanting the workplace to be a religious space. But what I was hearing from the workers, so this is called sort of bottom up ethnography. What I was hearing from the bottom up, the grassroots up, was I'm Catholic, I'm Católica, I pray the rosary before I go to my shift. I pray for health and safety because it's a very dangerous job. And I'm going to get to some of my critiques of the industry. And so just so you all know, as an ethnographer, I find it really important to go in trying to craft a middle ground, right? Being open to all perspectives. As scholars, we want to look at multiple perspectives, but also it's important that my job as a scholar is to come up with my own take on all this. And since the book has come out, what I would call an afterlife of the book has happened. And so I've been doing a lot of podcasts. I've been asked to do a lot of interviews. And I would say that today, so I have a new insights, sort of post-COVID and during COVID, because COVID again wasn't in the plans when I did my fieldwork. So back to Joe Blay. Here's a great picture of Joe, who was a former chaplain of the plant. And he was also the football, or what we call in the United States, the only place that calls it soccer. He was the coach of the Tyson Columbus Junction football team. Tyson, in addition to having the chaplaincy program, in this case, Joe was the coach of the football team, and they came in second place in 2017. As you can see, all of the players are African refugees, Congolese and Sudanese primarily. And since the book came out last September, I'm in frequent communication with quite a few of my interlocutors. Joe Blay and I had coffee last month, and he said the vast majority of new hires are Congolese. It's easier for plants to hire refugees than Latinos these days because of the E-Verify. And it's just, there's a lot of sort of legal issues that, it's very difficult for undocumented workers these days to be hired by plants. And I can share more information about that later. Another field site was West Liberty, Iowa. Again, this is from a Doce diciembre. This is not my picture. This is one that somebody shared with me. It's an incredible picture of the Marachina dancers, right? The faith, the Catholic faith, but also indigenous faith, right? Pre-Catholic colonization, and a huge image of the Virgin of Guadalupe. And so again, I think I've always been drawn to the beautiful reverence and faith of Latinos. And I was really interested once I realized so many of these workers work in the plant. So how does your faith work for you was one of my questions when you're in the plant, right? Many of my respondents, my interlocutors, said that they pray the rosary, as I shared a bit ago. Many of them have tattoos. Many of them pray to La Virgen for continued health. And so they'll make it home after a shift, because again, these are very dangerous jobs. West Liberty, Iowa, like Columbus Junction, Iowa, are what are called processing towns, right? These are the sites of the processing plants, right? These tend to not be the wealthier towns. Those tend to be the producer towns like Washington, Iowa. And so one of the things that I learned in my ethnographic research is that there's a real difference between producer and processing towns, right? Processing towns tend to be minority majority cities like Latinos, right? And increasingly African. And there are small pockets of Burmese, right? In Columbus Junction, there's a strong presence of Burmese refugees who also work at the plant. And so West Liberty, Iowa, again, is an example of a processing town. And there are many of these processing towns in our state. Ottumwa, Marshalltown, and Storm Lake, and Postville would be other processing towns. St. James Catholic Church wasn't one of my primary field sites, but I did spend quite a bit of time with Father Bernie Weir because I wanted to get a sense of comparing and contrasting the processing towns, which were really my focus, and those Catholic parishes and the meatpacking plants with the producer towns, which tend to be primarily white ethnic. In this case, would be Catholic, would be Irish, Czech, German, right? Here's an image of Father Bernie making pancakes for one of the many fundraisers at his parish. We spent a lot of time together. So again, Washington, Iowa was a producer town. This is where the hogs are raised, and other producer towns where the cattle are raised, right? These tend to be wealthier towns, right? They're also not as polluted. The land and the air tend not to be as polluted. You get a lot of waste from the animals, So that is an issue in these towns, but it's not as much of an issue, sort of hog waste, cattle waste, the pollutants that go into the air and waterways as we see in processing towns. I thought this was a very cute picture of the piglets. This is not what I saw when I was in the packing plants. Iowa hog CAFOs. In my research, I learned that CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations, pose a lot of challenges for our state, right? It brings in a lot of income, right? We're the #1 producer in pork, globally, not just nationally, but globally, right? And the market keeps growing for pork, AKA the other white meat. Hog CAFOs, as you may know, pose a lot of environmental challenges though, right? Again, I just mentioned the airways, waterways, ground, and they produce so much fecal matter that it's really hard. There's more than can actually be sprayed in farms. And so it's an ongoing issue. And I know we have colleagues at Iowa State and Iowa and you and I who are working on mitigation of waste. So there's really important scientific research going on. That's not my area per se, and I'm not a public policy person, but I've become much more aware of the importance of really good public policies and protecting our airways, our waterways, and our soil. Another field site that I decided on was Iowa Premium Beef in Tama, Iowa. I wanted to have a sense of a smaller operation as well as a non-hog operation. It's now been bought over by Iowa Beef, so it's Omaha based, but at the time when I was there, it was more independently owned. And so I did a whole week of field work in this plant. At Tyson, I did several day-long visits, but at IPB, I had amazing access. I stayed in a motel up the street. I worked probably the equivalent of like a 70-hour shift that week. And I'm happy to answer a lot of questions later about this, but this was a real turning point in my field work. It was the winter, sorry, I'm trying to think how many years ago. It was the winter of 2019. And I was able to see the whole line of production from the intake barn to when the meat actually is packaged and coming out in where the trucks pick it up, the semi trucks. And so I decided as an anthropologist, most anthropologists who have done work in meatpacking plants sort of go undercover and they literally work under a pseudonym. I decided to take a different tactic. I, pitched my project to the then CEO of the company. I had to have it vetted by the board. I said, I'm an anthropologist. I really want to know about what happens here. I think it's really important for the public to know. They were really intrigued by that, and they really wanted their story to be told. And also, I think it's important to mention that this book isn't a hit piece of the industry. It's really getting the reader to know what goes on in these packing plants. Very few of us know where our meat comes from. Very few of us also knows who produces our meat. So I really wanted the reader of this book, this project, to come away with a greater empathy and respect for the refugees, the brown and black refugees, workers who kill, process, and package the meat that many of us eat. And I also wanted the reader to come away with a sense of what happens inside these spaces, because so few of us know. And so I had some real goals of this book. I do a lot of sharing of chapters. I mean, I hold myself to very ethical, high standards as an ethnographer. So I shared the 2 chapters on Tyson and the 2 chapters of IPB with folks who ran the plant. They didn't have any quibbles with it. And so it was really important to me to share that, and also to share some chapters with some of my key interlocutors to get their feedback before the book came out. And so I wanted to share that with you. As a method, ethnography, what I do is primarily qualitative. I spend a lot of time, a lot of hours with people in the field, but also reading a lot of quantitative work that I myself don't do as a qualitative person, but I draw heavily on the very important quantitative data that quant folks do. And so servant leadership at Iowa Premium Beef, again, going back to this lexicon, this language of faith and values that I definitely heard at Tyson. I also heard at Iowa Premium Beef, they use the language of stewardship a lot. And as a scholar of American Christianity, someone who's trained as a historian, as an ethnographer, that really caught my ear and my eye, saying, okay, something's going on here. There's not a chaplaincy program at Iowa Premium Beef, but they do a lot of values and stewardship talk, right? When I was there, everyone I interviewed who was sort of at the top um, talked about how they were people of faith and how it was really important for them to be good leaders, for them to be good people, to have a factory that ran well, where they respected their workers. And it was really important for them to, they felt, to tell me that that mattered to them. What was really interesting too is that this plant was much more religiously diverse than the Tyson plant, primarily because it's beef and it's also halal, which is Muslim certified, right? So it's similar to kosher, but it's halal. And so many Jews also buy halal meat. So they're very similarly sort of certified. This is a halal certified plant. And during my week at the plant, I was taking a tour of the locker room, the women's locker room. There was a group of Muslim women on their break from working on the line, and they were performing their ablutions in the sink, washing their face, their hands, putting on their hijabs. And they had a little area. Those of you who read the book, this is in one of the later chapters. They had I just love religious ingenuity, right? And this was sort of an example of ingenuity at work. In this greasy locker room, no matter how hard the janitors try to keep it clean, there's always grease, right? I mean, this is a meatpacking plant. So in the midst of this, locker room, right, they had cordoned off these women a little area in the corner where they had their prayer rugs hanging over a shower, like almost like a half circle shower curtain. And so, and then they would lay the prayer rugs on the ground, and then they drew the curtain and they would do their call to prayer. And they are able to do this as long as they get permission from their line shift manager, sometimes twice during their shift. And so I was really impressed. There's a lot of literature now, faith at work. It's a growing area among sociologists. Rice University has a whole area in this now, by my colleague Elaine Howard Eklund, where they're looking at faith and work. And so I was able to really see how companies are really trying to honor this within limits, like one isn't able to pray during their entire shift, and also sort of like, interfaith. There's just a lot going on, right? And so it became very clear to me after doing field work at these two sites, Tyson and IPB, that faith, family, and values are very important at these field sites. Sorry, I'm thinking part of my slide is cut off a little bit, but there are just, this slide is just to illustrate to you, and I'm happy to make this slide. If any of you want a copy of it to share, I'm also happy to share that if you reach out. Iowa ranks as one of the top meat producing states in the country. In a lot of ways, our state is very similar to North Carolina in terms of the right, we're a right to work state. We tend to not be unionized. Very similar government level, a place where a lot of Latino immigrants and African refugees are settling. And so I'm thinking a lot of really good comparative work is starting to come out between Iowa and North Carolina. And if you're interested in any more sources, I'm always happy to give you more reading sources. And interestingly, what I found out too in my study and sort of doing the quantitative, digging into the quantitative data, Iowa is the high pay higher than other states in our slaughterhouses. It's very difficult, dangerous work. We pay better. So on average, $32,370 for a full-time line worker in our state. So here's the troubling part, right? As a scholar, right, I want to, again, going back to maintaining a balance, right? And trying to give you a full perspective of this phenomenon of the meatpacking industry in our state. Unfortunately, there's a lot of poop that comes out of these, right? So 440 million tons of poop is the amount of waste that comes out of confined, these CAFOs every year. And that comes out of Iowa State University, which, as you know, is the ag school in our state. And this was in Mother Jones, this particular graphic. But I have vetted this information, and it's very standard information. Hog waste, lagoons, and runoff. So hog waste is often stored in open air lagoons. You may have seen this if you drive through Ottumwa, for example. It's in these sort of open air lagoons, which can sometimes be, so those are confined lagoons, but they can be larger than 7 acres. So this is a problem, right? Because it smells bad. The ammonia goes into the air, the waste goes into the air. And so this is something environmentally that we really need to think about as a state. Another thing that really became very clear to me So now I'm going to shift into the afterlife of the book. And so the book was about what goes on. The book is, I should say, is about what goes on in packing plants. Who are the meatpacking plant workers today? And I contextualize it historically with the deunionization of meatpacking in major cities like Chicago and Cincinnati, and how these factories, starting in the mid 20th century, were moved into more rural areas, right? And so when we think about the history of Chicago, right, we think of slaughterhouses, we think of the jungle. When we think about Cincinnati, it's long been called Porkopolis. Slaughterhouses have been moved out of the inner cities and into rural areas. And once that started happening in the mid to late 20th century, we get this process called vertical integration, where insemination to slaughter is intricately linked. And I'll give you an example of this. So back in back of the yards in Chicago in the late 19th century, cattle was in the stockyards as hogs were in the stockyards in Cincinnati, right? But many had to be shipped in, right? There just wasn't enough room because the city was landlocked, right? And so this created issues. Refrigeration was an issue. Unionization became an issue to heads of companies, right? And so right around the mid to late 20th century, deunionization started to happen. And Iowa, North Carolina are two of those states, Arkansas, right? Nebraska, where these plants started moving to. And our state is one of the new host states for this new meatpacking phenomenon. And so there are insemination barns for hogs, right? Insemination barns for cattle. And so literally from insemination to birth to slaughter, it all takes place within like a 200-mile radius, maybe 300 miles. And so it's a very tightly controlled process where the companies, like with Tyson, right? They partner with farms, they partner with insemination barns, and so it's all linked back to the company. That became a very new phenomenon. Also, workers, in the history of Iowa is that our workers, since the late 20th century, the 70s, have not been unionized. Although we're seeing stirrings of unionization again that I will talk about. This is all the afterlife of the book. So when I did the research for the book was in press when COVID was hitting. So I literally had to go back. I had to get permission to go back, pull the book from being in press, and I had to sort of add some edits to the conclusion, saying, with COVID happening, right? And so what I'm calling the afterlife of the book is I've written some sort of small short essays that I've been asked to write. I'm in the process of writing some op-eds, like where are we today, right? So what I would say is in the afterlife of the book, I have personally become a bit more critical, much more critical in some ways of the packing industries, because we know now that the packing industries did not do enough to protect workers. And what I would say as a scholar who has the information at hand is that this lexicon of faith, family, and values that the CEOs and CFOs of the company hold so dear was not being trickling down into the workers who were sickened by COVID-19. And so this is an image of protections that were put in place, the plexiglass and the rubber, the dividers. It took a while for this to be put in place though. And so October 20th, 2020, a US House report came out that at least 59,000 meatpacking workers became ill with COVID-19. 269 died when the virus tore through the industry in 2020. Who was affected? Line workers, racial and ethnic minorities, the very people I interviewed for this book. Some of the people I interviewed for this book lost family members, right? Debbie Berkowitz, formerly of OSHA, this is a quote from her: "More workers have died from COVID-19 in the last 18 months in the meat and poultry industry than died from all work-related cases in the industry in the past 15 years, she said." End quote. I'll bet it's more than that now that we have better numbers. We now know that the numbers were underreported, not only in our state, but in other right to work states. And this is a problem, right? And so what I would say as a scholar is that the company's complicity has led to deaths. what is happening now? I am always a silver lining person, I think, as a human, right? And I think that probably also informs my scholarship. I think it's really important for us as scholars to be very middle ground and try to show that balance. And I'm heartened to tell you that there are positive grassroots movements that are happening now that are also deeply informed by faith. And so I'm going to share a little bit with you in my remaining time before we're able to open to questions and a conversation. And so there is a group that you may or may not have heard about on Facebook or on the news called Escucha mi voz, which means listen to my voice, listen to me in Espanol. All right. So it's primarily Latino, which I use the shorthand Latinx. It's sort of big in scholarship right now. It's shorthand, it's more inclusive. Some use the Latino slash slash O. I scrunched it together just for brevity for the slide. So primarily Latino meatpacking workers from the Tyson Columbus Junction and some from West Liberty Foods met to form a nonprofit back in the winter 2021 to demand COVID relief funds. Now, most of y'all in the audience, I know my family received COVID relief funds from the government, about $1,400. These workers, meatpacking plant workers, who were deemed essential workers by our current governor and by our former president, President Trump, were deemed essential workers. As you know, the line speeds were, you may or may not know, line speeds were set up. There was a lot of focus on producing meat, almost like wartime effort relief or wartime effort during COVID. At the same time that these workers were not being protected from COVID, right? The PPEs were not really in place yet for COVID. Very few of these workers received worker relief funds. Many of them are undocumented, but not all, right? And so what we see is this perfect storm, if you will, of workers who were deemed essential to our economy, working under conditions that were proven by a House investigating committee to not protect these workers. Over 269 workers have died because of that, right? So these workers are saying, listen, we're essential, but we have been excluded from, we need this money. Some of these workers had to take a leave of absence to take care of ill family members who were sickened from COVID from the meatpacking plants, right? And they're asking for what every other family in the United States received. They're asking for their work to be honored because they put food on our tables during a really difficult time. What we're also seeing in our state is Congolese and Latinx workers unite. Historically, as you may or may not know from labor history, anti-union efforts and deunionization efforts tend to pit workers against each other in unproductive ways. And it's really interesting though, right? Because when you're inside packing plants like I was, you see workers working side by side, Latinos from various countries, right? Africans from various countries taking lunch breaks together. It's highly integrated work culture, right? But deunionization efforts have historically, traditionally pitted workers against each other. So what we're seeing with Escucha mi voz and this movement for excluded essential workers to get government funds is that Latino workers and Congolese workers are working together. They also happen to be Catholic. So here is a Congolese Catholic woman and a Latinx Catholic woman meeting at the new Catholic, the second Catholic worker site in Iowa City. It's in right next to the College Green Park, those of you who are familiar. This just happened a couple weeks ago. So workers are starting to unite, mobilizing literally at a mobile home park. Escucha mi voz also has recently hosted assistance clinic for excluded and essential workers. This is from May 14th at the 3 mobile home parks in Iowa City. Again, helping workers apply for the $1,400 government stimulus checks that these workers very much need. And so Escucha mi voz has, members have been going to supervisors meetings all over the state over the last several months. I was privileged enough to be able to give a talk in Espanol and in Inglés at the supervisors meeting last October here in Johnson County. And our supervisors are currently they're about to disperse the funds, very soon after the applications go through. And so Escucha Mi Voz in a very short time is seeing a lot of results. And so we're really seeing workers unite, workers working together. So that is my last slide. I may have talked a little bit quickly. My kids are always telling me I talk a little too fast because I get excited. But I wanted to give you a sense of a little bit about the book, the research that went into Meatpacking America. And also, I think it's really important to talk about now that the book is out, what has happened, and a lot has happened. And I'm really heartened personally as someone who studies labor history, organizing, someone who studies faith, how faith informs people's perceptions of social justice, how all of this is starting to work together. The bishop of the Diocese of Davenport, Bishop Thomas Zinkula, is also a friend and interlocutor, and he has also been very involved with this initiative. And so what we're seeing is the Catholic Church in the area really becoming involved in worker mobilizing and really supporting workers, which is a strong thread of Catholic teachings and social justice. So that is my last slide, and I'm going to pause now, and I think Matt might be taking over now, and I look forward to questions and a conversation. So.
Well, thank you, Kristy. We have time for questions, and we have a few lined up for us already. But if you have a question and you haven't asked it yet, please submit it through the Q&A feature right here on Zoom. But please note, we may not be able to get to all the questions. So let's start. This is a two-part question. But in your book, you mentioned that workers and managers worked 6 or 7 days a week. What is the standard shift in hours per week for the workers? And is there regularly scheduled overtime?
Yeah. That's a great question. Yeah, standard shift. I mean, I think with that's really shifted a lot. That's been very malleable with COVID, right? Standard shift is 8 hours, but that oftentimes leads to paid overtime. Most workers, the majority of workers I talked with, work 6 days a week. Some work every day, but the ones who I did interview who have worked every day are not finding it to be very sustainable. But on average, is 6 days a week. And the majority of workers I interviewed before COVID, and those who I've kind of touched base with against after, are still continuing to work overtime and to work 6 days because there's such a demand for meat right now. That's a great question.
Our next question, what is the difference between an ethnographer and a sociologist? And how does each play a role in understanding the past and the present?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, excellent question. Sociologists, so qualitative research, ethnography is what many sociologists and anthropologists do. And it's interesting because my own books are marketed as sociologies of religion, but I don't have formal training in sociology. But a lot of the colleagues I give talks with, and we're on Zoom talks together, many of them are sociologists. So ethnography is a method of participant observation, right? It started with anthropology back in the 19th century, and it's all about immersing yourself in the field, whatever that field might happen to be. So you observe, you spend a lot of time observing, you spend a lot of time participating, asking questions, sometimes structured questions, oftentimes non-structured. So a lot of my interviews were structured, but sometimes, the most fruitful conversations were those that just kind of happen. And so it's a method that really requires you to pivot, and very frequently. And so sociologists also, many sociologists are ethnographers. There's also a term that you might hear that's called mixed methods. Many scholars like myself use what we call mixed methods. And so I do qualitative ethnography, but I also do social history. And I think it's really important to contextualize the ethnography that I did for this book with, like, the earlier chapters of the book are about Iowans, so the history of Catholicism, the history of meatpacking plants, because if we want to understand what's going on today, right, we really need to take a look back into what was going on. And so, yes, sociologists indeed do ethnography. At the University of Iowa, most of my colleagues here are more quantitative sociologists, but there's a couple who do qualitative work like mine. And so there's a lot of overlap. And in fact, at a lot of universities and even in colleges, sociology and anthropology tend to be combined into one department. And I find that exciting as a scholar, because I think that for so long, scholars, we were very siloed into I'm a sociologist, I'm an anthropologist, I'm a historian. And I'm finding that the humanities and social sciences today, there's a lot of overlap. And I think that's really great, because I learn from my sociologists who do quantitative work. We learn from each other. I learn from my historian friends, but that's a very long answer to your question. That's a great question.
Continuing down this path, actually, has the way that ethnographers conduct their research and fieldwork changed over time? And if so, how did that change what is being studied?
Oh, yeah, change over time. Yes. Boy, that's a really big, important question. I would say yes. I'd say one of the ways that doing ethnography and being an ethnographer has changed over time, whether you identify as a sociologist or an anthropologist, I'd say I identify as an ethnographer because of the method that I'm doing. But absolutely, I think how it's changed is that ethnographers today, whether they're in a sociology department, an anthropology department, or a religious studies department like myself, we tend to be more self-reflexive. We tend to bring more of ourselves into the project. We're very open with our interlocutors. There's a kind of openness and what I would call a dialectical exchange, I think. And there's just this kind of openness that, I'm coming at this from this perspective. My interlocutors will ask me questions, I'll answer. And so there's more of a give and take. And I think there's not that the give and take wasn't always there. I think it always has been there, but I think that we attend to that give and take more in our writings and in the talks that we're giving. And I personally think that's really important, because I think the reason why I became an ethnographer and why I identify so strongly with the method is that I think we're all linked by the human condition so much. And I learn so much from my interlocutors and the questions that they ask me too. And a lot of times the questions that I'm being asked figures in my articles and my books. And so I think that has been the biggest shift. If you look at sociologies coming out today, anthropologies, the ethnographic method, there's a real mindfulness of the method. And the book series that I edit and run, actually, what I love about the series is we're putting about 2 to 3 books a year. Is I created the series because I really want the scholars who end up getting their books out, I really want there to be a kind of a real deliberate meditation on what does it mean to do this kind of work, and how does this further the humanities, and how does this further. And so I find it a really exciting time. I always tell my students I became a professor because I didn't want to stop being a student, which is really true. I love learning. And I think that this recent turn in ethnography to really being open and honest about it's really a relationship that we're forming with people has been really good for scholarship and for our teaching too.
Well said. Let's shift gears. How have the Protestant and Catholic descendants of past European immigrants reacted to the movement of religiously and racially diverse immigrants currently?
Oh my gosh, that was a really rich question. I think I got part of it. Can you ask that again? I want to make sure I got it.
How have the Protestant and Catholic descendants of past European immigrants reacted to the influx of religiously and racially diverse immigrants in the present?
Yeah, it's been contested. Yeah, I mean, I think the descendants of white Protestant and Catholics in our state, as well as other states, have struggled, and I think we see that each and every day. That was one of the motivators for writing this book too. As a lifelong Midwesterner who's from Gary, Indiana, who is ethnically white, my dad's side's Lebanese, but they identify as white. My mom's side's Polish, white, Eastern Europeans. I'm from Gary, Indiana. There's a lot of racial tensions there, and it's a predominantly Black metropolis today. My family was one of the last families to move out of Gary, right? And in part of a white flight into working class communities surrounding Gary. And so I think that was, just to be full disclosure, and I fully disclose this in the book, I've long been disheartened, interested in sort of white backlash, right? But also wanting to complicate that white backlash, because I think that as I write in the book in various places, I wanted this book to be what I would call a cold take, if you will. There's a lot of hot takes in the media. For example, I was just full of a bunch of racist white Trump supporters. I think that's a really unnuanced, uncomplicated portrayal of our state. And it's a similar to a portrayal of my home state of Indiana. And so as a scholar, I wanted to go in and talk to a lot of people. I spent a lot of time with white meat packing plant CEOs and guys who are at the top. If you read the later chapters, I'm really open about ways that my own moods and motivations were challenged, right? And how I had maybe internalized certain stereotypes. And so I think that our state is I think that's why rural America is so important to study, because we're ground zero for the new immigration, right? We're a secondary migration hub, meaning migrants and refugees who come to our state, we're not usually the first destination. They usually come in, New York or California or Arizona, but they make or Atlanta, but they make their way here for work, and tensions arise, right? But we also see examples of success and interfaith cooperation, and whites really wrestling with the racism that they inherited, not completely letting go with it, but being cognizant of it. So I'm really trying to complicate in this book the trope of the white racist, as much as I'm trying to complicate the trope of the brown and black refugee worker, right? Who's here at the pleasure of whites and who shouldn't get the government assistance check, right? So I'm really pushing back on both tropes and both negative portrayals, and I'm trying to complicate them. I have a phrase in the book that I call the sticky wicket of whiteness. I'm not trying to explain away white racism, but I'm trying to make sense of it a little bit more, and my own part in that history, right? As someone who sits within that milieu, right? I hope I answered that question. That was a really great question and very, very important.
Of course. And our next question is about the towns and the areas. Are there special housing areas in each processing town for the immigrant workers, and are there schools?
Yeah, and this is something that I didn't have in the slides, but you'll find, immigrant workers and refugees who have been here a while tend to live in homes of multi-generations, right? But more often than not, you see trailer parks, right? For more recent migrants, right? So you'll have multi-generations living together in homes, also in trailer parks. And they're mixed in terms of the quality, right? I mean, the trailer park area in Columbus Junction isn't as nice, like aesthetically on the outside. And they're also somewhat hidden away, right? I think trailer parks, mobile home parks tend to be hidden away, right? They tend to be thought of in a certain way by city planners, right? And so I think that that's something public policy wise that would be really important maybe for the packing plants to think about. I mean, maybe even providing some housing or providing better, living standard of living, especially when workers first come over to work at Tyson, right? That's a great question. I think, take a drive in any of these towns. If you go to Marshalltown, for example, the plant there's housing, right? Literally, the plant is in the middle of a neighborhood. And it's mostly single family dwelling, multifamily dwelling. There's a trailer park off to the way, but yeah, I mean, these tend to be poor areas. Oftentimes the sewage is an issue. I think that these cities can do more to support the neighborhoods and parks where these migrants and refugees are living. So.
In your book, you mentioned that the immigrants were thankful for their jobs, but they didn't want their children going to the same profession. Did you get a sense of why?
Yeah, that's a great question. I did, and I think even more so since COVID, right? I've touched bases with some of the folks I interviewed for the book to kind of see where they are now. I'm just checking on them to see if they're okay. I've been worried. Yeah, none of the workers, the Black and brown workers, right? Black African workers and Latinos I interviewed want their children on the line because it's dangerous, it's dirty. They smell, they inhabit the smells. It's hard to, I'm very descriptive in the book. Those of you who've read the book, it's very descriptive. If you haven't read it yet, I would recommend that you not eat meat before you read the later chapters. That's somewhat intentional because I really want to bring the reader into this. So the workers I interviewed do not want their kids doing this job. They want them to go to college. a couple families I interviewed, like, well, maybe if my kid works at Tyson, I want him to be at the top. I want him to be like a CEO. They don't want him on the line doing this work. But at the same time, it was important for me to message in the book that none of the workers I interviewed are ashamed of the work that they're doing. They're proud of it. They know this is like really important, difficult work. And so there's an amount of pride and there's not shame in the work that they're doing. And one of the things that I try to get across in the book, in the thick descriptions I give of the work itself, is that oftentimes we hear that this is unskilled labor. I really push back on that too, saying this is actually really highly skilled labor. I mean, to get through a shift without cutting off a limb or injuring yourself, that is a skill. And being able to trim the fat off of the flesh to a certain degree to meet the company standard, that is a skill. Being able to saw these huge hog carcasses in half, that is a skill. And so there's a pride among the workers in the skills, but they don't want their kids doing this, because it's not because they're ashamed, but because they want their kids. They don't want them to come home bloody or sore or to risk injury. So they're doing this for their families. And as a result, these meatpacking plants are constantly having to turn. There's a lot of turnover in this industry, right? Most of these plants are, like going to the Congo or going to Mexico. They're recruiting in oftentimes mostly poor, right? War-torn, economically impoverished places. So think about it, right? This is something I try to get through in the book too, that the men and women in these violent slaughterhouses, places where animals are being killed and where there's blood and there's flesh hanging, and they're really gruesome places. These are the same men and women who are fleeing war-torn countries. They're fleeing economic poverty, they're fleeing economic persecution, political persecution, domestic violence. Many of the women I interviewed are victims of rape. And so they're leaving situations that cause PTSD to enter into a factory that one could understand could cause PTSD. And some of the workers I talked about having PTSD and how they're medicated because of their jobs on anti-anxiety pills. So yeah, it's none of these workers, they're proud that they do it, that they can get through a shift, but they don't want their children or their grandchildren doing this work. It's a great question.
And this will be our last question today.
Yeah.
You mentioned that some meatpacking plants have a commitment to faith. Does that extend to wage analysis, like looking at supervisory executives and line workers? If not, do you see a possibility of this happening?
Of more wage? Say that again. I want to make sure I got the language right of that.
Correct. So the commitment to faith in these companies, does that extend to wage analysis on the different levels of work?
That's a great question. I think I understand it. So is the question more about how, that the CEOs at the top, were their salaries included in the actual line workers in the chart that I showed? Yeah, no, this was a line worker, someone who's on the line in the slaughterhouse. See, the folks who are not on the line are making upwards of like 70 grand, 80 grand. I mean, they're making 3 times as much for their non-line, non-invasive work. So yeah, there's a huge discrepancy in pay, right?
With that answer, we're hitting about 2 minutes off to 1 o'clock. So we'll bring this webinar to a close, keep us on time. But I think we can all agree this has been a very informative lunch. So thank you very much, Kristy. I appreciate having you here and learning a lot today.
Thank you, and reach out if anyone wants to have more questions or anything. I'm at the university, so just reach out by email. So,
of course, and thank you to everyone joining us today. And we'd like to extend another thank you again to Kristy. We hope everyone will sign up for our future Iowa History 101 webinars that take place on the 2nd and 4th Thursdays throughout the year. There are many great stories from Iowa's past to tell in the upcoming months. Now, for more information and to register for future webinars in this series, check out our website at iowaculture.gov. This webinar and past presentations are available on our website as well. And while you're there, you can look into some other fantastic digital programs. We have our Goldie's Kids Club activities for young historians, or watch video recordings of the Iowa Stories series, which is hosted by our Iowa City branch. We look forward to virtually seeing you here again Thursday, June 9th. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great afternoon. Thanks, everyone.